And welcome back. And welcome on screen, Rafa. And look, it's a Pro Tools session.
Yeah, it's a Pro Tools session. And actually, I wanted to bring something that I have done very, very recently. I just worked on this like maybe a week ago. It's going to be released in about 2 or 3 days. And it's a session that actually holds a very special place for me because I work on this same exact song, but performed by a different artist 17 years ago. So this is something, a remake of the song with a completely different style, in a completely different style, you know.
Wow. Well, we're looking forward to hearing it. So who is the actual artist again?
The original artist that actually performed this song and wrote this song is Alejandro Sanz. He's a Spaniard based in Miami now. And he wrote and released this song 17 years ago. It's a very special song because actually I even won Best Engineering for this song, a Grammy for Best Engineering for this song, for this album actually. But now we did a remake of the song with a flamenco artist. So it has the flamenco flavor, it has the whole flamenco vibe by an artist called Joseantonio Rodriguez. He's a guitar player. He doesn't sing at all. He's a guitar player, instrumentalist, super, super highly regarded in Spain and around the world. And he brought, a group of guest singers, Pablo Lopez from Spain, India Martinez, another flamenco singer, Pele. There are 2 more, Gian Marco from Peru, and damn, I'm forgetting the 5th name. Let me tell you right now. And oh shit, it will come to me. But this is just a very, very special version because Joseantonio Rodriguez was the guitar player who played the underlying, flamenco guitars in the original version 17 years ago. And then he actually ended up going on tour with the artist, with Alejandro Sanz. So, and I'm actually opening this session just to open the conversation, really, because this session doesn't have any drums, but people are like super, super welcome to ask me about drums, about how I treat drums, how I treat bass, many other things. It has percussion, it has bass, it has a lot of acoustical elements, especially percussive elements. It's a very simple session, but it has that acoustical element to it. So,
well, we can't wait to hear it.
Okay, so let me play a little bit. Should I play maybe all the way to the first hook? And yeah, let me wear headphones. Here we go. Hey.
No es lo mismo tú que otra, entérate. No es lo
So yeah, that's a little taste of the song. In reality, if you listen to the original one that you can easily go online and look for it, Alejandro Sanz, No es lo mismo. It's a very highly powered, drum, kick and bass, drums and bass, based, super powerful song. The big anecdote about this session is that it is the very first song I ever recorded with Alejandro. This was the song that we actually started working on. And I remember being booked at Criteria Studios in Miami, and somebody messed up the whole schedule in terms of who was going to be recording first. Obviously we were going to start recording drums and bass. It was Anthony Jackson on bass, Vinny Colaiuta on drums, and a big array of other musicians, including Michael Landau and Joseantonio Rodriguez on all of the nylon and acoustic and flamenco guitars. But the day we started pre-production, which we were gonna do for 3 days, they told us, Vinny is here. And I'm like, what? Vinny is what? Yeah, Vinny is here in the studio. He's gonna be in the studio in about 2-3 hours, and he's wondering, what time you want him to start setting up, or how do you wanna. I'm like, no, he was supposed to be here like in 3 days, 2-3 days. So that's for real. That's how it happened. And this is the very first song, and I had to improvise even the whole drum miking thing, because I thought about it, but I didn't actually do any setup. And we were actually in Studio A, the biggest room at Criteria, the Hit Factory. And it's a huge room. And for a really tight drum recording, it doesn't just work like that unless you super close mic, and that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to capture the air of the drums. I wanted to capture, the whole, the dimension of Vinny's playing. He's all about nuances. Even when he plays like super hard, there's so much nuance to everything he does. All of those ghost notes, and all of his work on the hat and the overheads. And so basically I blanketed 3/4 of the studio, or 2/3 of the studio. I blanketed, and I used gobos around the drums, so I could actually move the gobos in and out of the drums in order to create the spaciousness of the overheads. Because the overheads, to me, it gives you the overall sound of the drums and the spaciousness of the drums. That's why I always start working on the overheads before I even treat the kick or the snare. I really don't understand when people just start working on kick and snare, because sometimes 50 to 70% of the kick and snare sound, and especially the snare and the toms, comes from the overheads. So that's the story behind the song. For this version, we wanted to do something really featuring Jose Antonio's playing, his art. He's such an artist. You can hear it, the nuances in his playing, it's quite an art form, the way they understand, chord progressions and all of the improvisation that happens in between, the rhythm, the rhythmic aspect of the song. So for this song, what's really driving everything, and that's the first thing that I always evaluate when I'm receiving a song to mix, is what is the essence of the song? What's the driving factor of the song? Is it the vocals? Is it the guitars? Is it 50% both of them? What's going to support them? Do we want the hook to really explode, or do we want it to really stay steady and mellow? Which in this case, that was the approach. Not like, the original version, where when you get to the hook, it really explodes in a way. And there's even a preparation to that explosive moment going into the hook. In this case, no, that wasn't the idea. This is, in a way, this is more artsy. It was a more artsy approach to. It was just the journeys through the song. So
I have a question here from Pablo
yeah,
who's saying, this is a really beautiful track. How do you manage to keep your instruments sounding so natural sounding?
by specifically uh, analyzing, imagining in your head their spaces. You know, um, when if you don't imagine spaces, specific spaces for each one of the elements of the mix that are important to you, um, then you are not gonna succeed, because then you are gonna start compromising with over EQing things, over compressing things, because you are going to have to fight for the space, and the only way to do it is going to be by using those tools, which I use anyway, and I do whatever I need to do, but not unnecessarily. I try to avoid unnecessary steps, right? First, always start with the full sound. I try to make the full sound work for the song. And when it's conflicting with something else, the best first thing that you can reach for is panning, and not just panning. To me, uh, plugins like S1 or any elements that allow you to even tilt the positioning of the stereo are amazing. To me, is one of the less, one of the elements that people speak less about, and people speak so much about parallel compression and about, which I use a lot, by the way, and the original track has a lot of that, parallel compression. People talk a lot about that, but they don't talk about uh, working out the space just with the element of panning and imaging, and even for stereo sources, I work the hell out of them using S1. That's one of the things that I use a lot, and not just with the specific elements of the mix, but also, let me see if I can find one, but even with effects returns, very often, for example, here, I have an M7. In this case, I was just widening it a little bit, but I work out very carefully, what's the spread of each one of the reverbs, but in context. I never do any of this before playing the track or before applying um, the processing. I apply the processing, and then I find the right space, and I do a lot of monoing of reverbs of even existing stereo reverbs. For example, I could go with this reverb, and if I wanted to apply it to a specific element of the mix, I could actually tilt it in a specific kind of way, right? And I could go even all the way and tilt it in a way that occupies a space surrounding that instrument. I do that quite a lot. Um, and even monoing, these sources, monoing, and then using the panning possibilities that you have, the rotation and the asymmetry to find that space. And you do all of this by ear, but you do it within context. I will never do it in solo. Solo is only for double checking if you have missed the point, but not for actually mixing. I will never mix. Solo is your worst enemy
It
while
is
you're
because
mixing.
it takes everything out of context, and suddenly you're not working.
Exactly.
So the Pablo Gabriel, I think that Rafa just answered your question. While we're talking about dealing with different challenges, Rafa, there's a question here from Javier, who's saying that with all of the collaboration on songs these days, with so many different singers, do you have problems matching the colors of vocals recorded with different mics in different rooms when you're dealing with what we discussed earlier, which is the fact that online recording has been around for like 10 years?
Yeah, actually, we have been dealing with it for quite a long time. A lot of even big artists have their own home studios, and they travel a lot. For example, when I worked with Lady Gaga, I remember talking with Fernando Garibay, who was going, and DJ Sado, who were going on the road with her all the time, talking about how they had to improvise, looking for studios all the time around the world. I actually helped them find a couple of studios in Europe during one of the tours, and the circumstances will be different all the time. They will have to record in hotels. in buses, backstage in a venue, because those were the only possible times to do it. There wasn't much time, available to her. So we have been dealing with it for a long time, and there are tools, again, like Q-Clone, that you can use brilliantly to, match EQs and mimic EQs. You can also, use specific plugins to get rid of the existing ambience in a recording by working, instead of, attack and the release, working on the release, so the release is shorter, so you actually suck up, some of that room ambience. That actually does help quite a lot, especially in the mid-low range, mid frequencies, where there can be like real booming problems between 200 and 600, 700 hertz. Very often, when you work in those kind of environments, you're going to encounter some kind of problem. Yeah.
It's a challenge. Okay, so one of the things that you've mentioned is that you deal with drums first. There is a question here, and I kind of figured let's get to it because I promised him we would. It's from a guy whose name is Testing Ground, which I'm not sure is his real name. Hi Rafa, if you run parallel compression on drums, do you then feed the parallel tracks through a final drum bus along with the original tracks?
I usually do. But depending on what's my final processing on the drums. For example, if I have the whole drum set and I'm doing a specific processing to each one of the elements. By the way, I do a lot of parallel processing for the kick and the drum themselves, just by themselves, like where I treat the snare in a specific kind of way, and then on a duplicate track or another track, either on the console or in the box, in the Pro Tools session, I process the snare differently to bring a specific element that I might be missing on the snare. For example, the ring of the snare. If I wanted to ring longer, I use a specific type of compression where I exacerbate that. I bring that out quite a lot. Those, for example, will always go to the main drum bus. And then there is the overall parallel compression processing. For example, I might have a TG123345, which is one of my favorite plugins from Waves, which, by the way, I have actually the original console with the original compressor and the original even EQs and filters and all of that. And I have been using it in the hardware form for many, many years, but the plugin works brilliantly. I might do some really, really heavy processing on it with the plugin. Let me actually pull the plugin so people can actually see what the plugin looks like. Let me create a stereo track, which is going to be my, let's say, like test track, right?
We're working on the fly here, folks. We're working on the fly.
And I'm actually going to bring...
Don't forget your headphones, Rafa.
Yes, I'm gonna wear them right now. I have some drums here. Let me solo these drums. These are from a different session, but I wanted to have some available just in case we saw any of this. This is actually a very atypical drum sound, and it might be actually great for testing, this kind of parallel compression. But I have these drums. Let me mute the other feed. Let me mute it. Let me look for it. Mute it. Okay, here we go. For example, let me try with other drums to see which one actually will fit the bill. Okay. So I have 3 different drum sets. They're actually very mellow. They're not, and I did it purposely to demonstrate a couple of things. There's these drums. There's these ones. Okay, no, I prefer the other one for this demonstration. And there's this one, for example, right, with a lot of low end.
Rafa, we can't hear a thing.
Yes. You cannot hear a thing?
No, because if it's not going through the feed, remember to us.
Ah, no, so sorry. Okay, here we go. Now you'll be able to hear it. Okay. So you hear that, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we have these drums. I was actually looking into other examples like this one, and I have this other one. I prefer to maybe work with those two. I selected. So let me isolate those two. Okay. For example, if I have these drums, and if I wanted to, let me do it simply by duplicating the track and applying to do like a super, super simple demonstration of this. And if I had the compression I was talking about, something like the, here it is, the TG, right? Let me just listen to the process track, not the other one, just the process one. Let me apply some compression, some high-end boosting, and actually some low-end boosting. Check out how this is actually a very kind of extreme setting. For example, for something like this, I might, apply some pre-EQ to just, which is something we do quite a lot, EQ pre-compression, even though I have EQ in here. For example, right now it's going the EQ first, then the pre, and then the dynamics, right? I can even, well, it's too much, it's distorting because of the low end. For example, if I encounter something like this on my parallel channel, I might want to filter slightly the low end. Let me go to a 550B. I might actually want to save off I might even go to, so I can even now push it harder without that extreme low end, right? And by itself, I will never, or most probably I wouldn't use this sound, right? I'm actually gonna change the levels here through my controller. Let me show you the two tracks. Here are the two tracks. And here's the level of my return. So this is the drums, the main track. And this is me adding the parallel compression. I'm gonna mute it. See how I'm working actually on the spaciousness of the drums.
Absolutely.
I'm not necessarily doing this to get more low end, or I might not necessarily do it to get more high frequencies. But for example, one of the uses of the 12344 for me is to create that shimmer in the top end and to create that spaciousness to the drums. Imagine this with a very, very hard hit drum kit that's really kicking it. It's amazing. To me, it's one of those amazing plugins that work actually most of the time. And then I decide if this goes through the drum bus as he was asking, or it goes straight to my stereo bus, to my mix bus. Because if it gets further affected by the drum bus, if I have another light compression of it, it might be too much or it might not be desirable. So these are the kind of things I decide, because if you add it to the drum bus, you are creating more glue with this element. There's more glueness to it. There's more, in a way, confusion about the sound. There is less of a distinct sound. But if I send it directly to the stereo mix bus, it is a more distinct element of the mix.
Right.
It's not blended as much.
So while we're still on that, Russell, g'day Russell, has asked, so you say that you'll process a snare, then process a parallel version to bring out the ring. Are you sending the original processed snare to the parallel, or is the parallel a duplicate of the original non-processed snare, and then you process that for the ring there?
Most of the time is the process one.
Okay.
Most of the time it is the process one, because I I approach the mix most of the time because obviously we break the rules all the time. We break the rules continuously, but most of the time, I want to have a sound that I'm pleased with. I try to be very very effective with it. I get the sound that I'm really looking for with the original snare. I don't I don't immediately depend on trickery to create what I'm looking for. But then, it's up to your imagination, and that's basically the art of mixing, having a big big imagination. Actually, it's about being more imaginative than most people. I think that's one of the biggest virtues that you can have as a mixer. And you just try things, you just go nuts about trying things, and it's like you imagine, wow, what if the space was more like to the side or behind you, or it felt uh, like it was moving from one part of the song to the next. That's where you start using trickery, because then you depend on whatever tools that you can, you know you might have available. For example, same thing I was talking about, the glue for the process. By the way, this kind of processing I wouldn't necessarily do on the whole drums. I will usually avoid the room microphones for this kind of parallel compression. I'll usually put it on the overheads, add a little bit of the kick, add a little bit of the snare. And in order to do that, you need to have level control on the sense. So you need to have an auxiliary send. Okay. Here I did it just in order to be practical. I did it on the whole drum set, but imagine this was just um, I had all of the individual tracks of the drums. I could use an aux, an a stereo aux, in order to send the overheads. And I usually start with the overheads because I love what parallel compression does to the full overheads.
So
And
while we're
then I start adding the kick, the snare.
No, okay, no, that's fine. It's like, I mean, your drum. The one of the things about your percussion, especially in this type of music, that you're so dang good at, is that you continue to get all of that punch in it, but it's also so spread out so that when you're listening to it through speakers the old-fashioned way in front of you, you feel like you're being enveloped by the music. And Christopher has asked, how do you handle spacing with reverb and delays while retaining that punch? And Ishan has asked, do you work your mix up in mono? If not, how often do you check? And I think those can be part of the same question in a way, because when you listen to this mix, I've listened to this mix a few times in the last few days with you, and it's like, it's so big, yet everything is so spread. How do you retain punch while you're dealing with reverbs and delays and things like that?
By being specific with the rivers, like I was mentioning earlier, like when I saw the S1, by making good use of the S1 for spaces, uh, reallocating the spread of those river returns. Many of my rivers are not full stereo all the time. There is a lot of monoise kind of rivers allocated to a specific range of the stereo field, like surrounding uh, a specific instrument. For example, if I have the guitar here, I might have the river surrounding it like this, or even farther to the left. So you hear some of the splash or extra wideness provided by the river. Same with delays. The delays, very often, I dedicate specifically to the instruments. For example, to a specific guitar, to a specific hit, to a specific percussion. So it actually trails and follows that instrument. And then I have the overall effects that stay in stereo all the time. And to me, those are, in terms of, we're talking about the glue or being very distinct in the mix, those are the kind of that's the kind of reverb glue that I will use for a mix in order to bring even instruments together. For example, I might use 5 different reverbs on a vocal, and one of them might be just a tiny little uh, splash, immediate space. For example, another great plugin that I use a lot to create that, specifically with vocals, let me find it. Let me see if I have any in this session. I'm pretty sure I used some somewhere. Some of the reverb.
While you're going through this, I'm just curious, how many tracks in this session?
This session doesn't have that many tracks. Let's see. It might have, it's just what you see. Percussion, we have a cajon, pandero, djembe. We have like a, let me actually start like dissecting some of the elements of the mix. Let me mute these drums. Yes, we're an input. So for example, we have the cajon, which is used in flamenco music a lot. This is something that was inherited from Peruvian music because the cajon comes originally from Peru. This is one element that drives a lot, you know, it's one of the main rhythmic elements of flamenco. We have a pandero that complements, we have a djembe. Then we have some low hits that you will hear here.
Love that low end.
Then we have like a cantaro. Cantaro will be like a ceramic kind of, you know, jar is gonna hit right now. And then when we get to the hook, we have this extra high element here when I put it in. It gives it that extra, you know, elements. And then we have the PS, which is, you know, a flamenco dancer, you know, like just hitting with the foot. It's footsteps actually, you know, which is very, very flamenco. Then something that's recorded, one of the main elements in flamenco music is the palmas, just clapping, just the claps, right? And I have two sets of claps. For example, I have these claps, and then I have these other claps, and then complement each other. Actually, one set of the claps actually has even voices, you know, making comments along the music. Check this out. I was looking at somewhere else, but here I have it. For example, I have an Abaroa Studios chamber. I love these plugins in order to create space. Check this out. I'm gonna mute actually all of the reverbs so you see what it is doing for the palmas, for the claps. This is without. And by the way, I also have a doubler here, which is creating a little more of, you know, a spreadness within the context. This is when we're talking about creating spaciousness. Same applies for plugins like the doubler. You know, being able to pan specifically each one of the returns, as you see here, are going to give you a completely different result. Are going to give you a completely different kind of a spread. And those are the little details that I work a lot. And see what the Abaroa is doing. It's actually putting the claps in a simulated real space, right? Let me add more so you see the kind of this is the kind of for this kind of music, the kind of effect that I will use a lot on many different elements of the mix, even on vocals, to create that early reflections, that smaller room but bright, that gives you an uplifting feel, you know, to the instrument. And then on top of this, palmas, we have the nudillos. The nudillos basically, let me show you. The nudillos are just, you know, hitting the, you know, a surface with the knuckles, right? And it actually complements the palmas. So, and then on top of it, we have the jaleo, which is also very flamenco, which is, you know, let's say like the ad-libs, you know, the comments, ad-libs of the musicians, you know.
The dynamic bass in that is amazing.
And sometimes for something like this, I even apply parallel compression to the whole bass. I create, but that's an after fact decision. I try to create the landscape, see how it actually interacts with elements like the bass, see how much space I have it, right? See how it's interacting between that low hit and the bass. Sometimes I decide to even duck a little bit those hits or the bass. I have to decide sometimes, and very often I do it with manual automation, automating some of those hits and copy and pasting, or you do it by using a plugin and ducking it. And for example, see how this blend sounds right now? When we're talking about gluing, what will happen if I bus it to the same bus as the percussion?
Wow.
Other than the level difference, and let me demonstrate it by duplicating the track, because this is something kind of like basic concept, but very, very important. The difference between these two. Let me zoom in here in the console so I can easily switch between one and the other. And let me actually even change the level of this return.
I hope everybody's enjoying this. This is a true masterclass in how to mix this kind of music and how to arrange it.
So here's the bass going to a distinct, going straight to the stereo bus, right? And this is how it interacts with the percussion. Let me go to a less busy part of the song. Right here. See how different it sounds by the bass going to the same bus as the percussion. I don't know if you can hear the difference clearly, but here's going to the stereo bus. Going to the percussion bus. Talking about the glue element in a mix, right? For example, if I wanted to go in an in-between part of it, always taking into consideration, obviously, what you're doing to phase and whatnot. But if I wanted to do that, instead of, I'm just gonna go back to the original bass that's going to the stereo bus, right? I have it here. Let me put it in view. This track here. Let me make it bigger. And I'm sending to the percussion bus by going through this fader. Obviously, you hear a level difference because I'm adding more bass by feeding it into the percussion bus. But regardless of that, listen to the texture. I'm going to exaggerate it a little bit. This is without. I'm going to play the same section, going to the. See how it's more blended with the low end of the percussion elements. Those are the kind of things that I use a lot in a mix. This kind of tools in order to decide what to blend and what not to blend. And I specifically do a lot of this with vocals and background vocals. For example, if I have a lead vocal and I have a group of background vocals that I want specifically to blend more with the lead vocal, I will send some of it to the same bus as the lead vocals, being processed through the same overall compression and things like that. And if I don't have something like that, I create it. I make sure first that it works great with the lead vocal and it complements the lead vocal. and once I'm sure it complements the lead vocal and works amazingly well with it, and then I send some of the background vocals to it, and I create that kind of blend between the two elements.
I actually have some questions here about dealing with vocals in specifically. Let me find them. They were right here. Okay, the first question I've been asked, when you're working with how vocals mix with the rest of the session, are you doing much compression and EQ on those vocals, or are you side chaining them and using kind of like a parallel process so that they sit but they're still dynamic? Or and also the other question connected to that is, how are you doing all that and keeping control of all that bass? Because your bass, Rafa, is pristine. It's really pristine. So while we're talking vocals, let's focus on the vocals first, though.
Yeah. Depends on the track, depends on the style of music. For example, if I was working on something very lyrical, like right now I'm producing an operatic kind of project with a very well-known tenor. It's just piano and vocals. I wouldn't dare use parallel compression for that, only because there is some value to the integrity of the vocal per se as it is. I don't want to add any other artifacts to the vocal that come with parallel compression. Keep in mind, no matter how well you do it, you are always incorporating some kind of phasing issues into the equation, into your mix, into your sound. For some styles of music, it is truly, truly desirable. I mean, for pop music, for urban music, you name it, for many styles of music, electronic music, even in an orchestra. Let me give you the example. If I'm mixing an orchestra for a classical project, I will probably use any parallel compression very carefully, with paying very special attention to that phasing, to those possible phasing issues. But for example, if I'm doing it for a cinematic kind of a score, for something that, like last year, the year before, I did one with Daddy Yankee. It's an urban track with a big orchestra behind it. I don't care about it. I really want that aggressiveness. I want the brass even to sound a tiny little phasey with it. So I can actually abuse that parallel compression. So it's all a matter of judgment. It's all a matter of personal judgment. See how it actually fits with the style of music and the style of the track that you're working on. And by the way, I don't have the stigma ever of thinking, oh, you can do that because this is jazz, or you can do that because this is opera, or over the past 30 years, I have, and especially in the last 10, I have produced everything from opera to classical, to hip hop, to R&B, scoring for movies. I mean, I've done so many different things, and the stigma disappears when you realize that people just want to hear emotion and impact. They don't care about anything else. They don't care about your techniques. They don't care about how you do it. Obviously, we do care about the techniques. We do care about the technology, because that's the way that we can accomplish, what we need to do. But for them, they actually, very often, they don't need to know. It's better not to show them, okay, this is how I did it, or this is how your vocal sounds with and without the processing, or this is how much I did to your track. I think that's a trade secret, something that you should keep to yourself as a professional when you are dealing with, especially with an artist. Very often, unless they are technically inclined and they truly want to know, you're just creating emotion, and they can hear that, they can sense that, they can feel it in their skin. That's all that matters. So, and you had a second question that I forgot about.
The question was
About the low end, or
there was, well, yeah, there was the low end, but the first part of it was from Dayton, who said, "How do you maintain the integrity and identity of a vocal on a track with that many instruments?" He said he starts good, but with time the instruments start taking over the song.
always reevaluating the mix with the vocals from the very beginning. That's something I learned early on in my career. Uh, when you're building the track, even when you are building, drums and bass, even at that stage, if I had like a super busy and super heavy drum and bass track, or a super heavily, like this is actually not overly, heavy, but it can be a little busy. I incorporate the vocals early on. As I'm working on the percussion and as I'm working on that low hit, I incorporate the vocal, and I see where there could be a conflict of interest between those elements. And I work it out. I work it out not just with EQ, but I work it out with the space. Space is super important. Just a minute panning of one of those elements can leave enough room for the low end of the vocal to speak.
So when we're talking, the difference between a processed sound and a really transparent sound, how do you feel about plugins like HLS or the Pi compressor as something that you would use in a mix like this to try and keep it as transparent sounding as it does?
Let me actually give it a try. I'm actually a super, super fan of the Pi compressor. So let me actually work on a duplicate of the bass, right? And let me apply the Pi. With the Kramer, what is it? Was it? Here it is, Kramer Pi. By the way, there are two of the Kramer plugins that I truly love, and it's not just the Pi, but also the HLS. I freaking love it. One thing about the Pis, and you will notice, even behind in my rack, I have some of the original Helios Pis in my rack, so I know them very well, and I have 4 more of these Pis, the hardware version of it. The plugin is brilliant. I really love it, and I'm very, very glad that you guys did this one and work on this one. Even with the noise that it can add to the equation, you can always write the noise out by even before you apply any plugin, noise reduction plugin to it. Forget about it. Even use your manual writing, automating, the decay of some of the notes so the noise doesn't come across, because obviously my track has quite a lot of low end. Let me actually even filter some of the low end so we can actually be more extreme with the compression.
It also really helps when the guy playing the bass is an absolute genius.
Yeah, actually, I remember the name of the other main vocalist of this song, which is Miguel Poveda. He's in the flamenco world, he's a superstar. He's like, I'm sorry, I forgot his name. Miguel Poveda is the other singer. And this plugin adds so much vibe to anything you put it on. So much vibe. And check out also, the other plugin I was talking about, the Kramer HLS. It's another of my go-to plugins that I use all the time, because we're talking vibe, texture, what this plugin does to the mid frequencies and what it does even to the very low. For example, this bass doesn't need any extra low end, okay? Let me get rid of what I did here very quick so it's not interacting. This is the original bass, right? check out what kind of, you know, gluey sub low that you can add with this. This plugin, the Helios stuff, the same as the Sound Techniques vintage stuff, which are also owned, you know, some of the original pieces of gear, is very tricky because even the frequencies, when they show you, they are not for real. They're trying to deceive you. It says 160 is not 60. It says 120 is not 120. You have to basically follow your ears. You are actually going higher than that because the curves are different than any other EQs that we might get used to. Like, for example, if I boosted at 60 with a different EQ, I wouldn't be affecting 100 hertz as much as I am doing right now. This one actually goes quite higher than what it actually shows. Let me get rid of this, but check out what it does to the mids. Let me exaggerate so you can really hear it. Go a little bit higher. Let me actually apply this to the track in the real session with everything playing on. Let me mute it first. I have it here. I got rid of the other bass. Yes, here's the full track. See how much more the fingering comes across in the mix. If that's what I was looking for, I will definitely use the Kramer HLS. I love this plugin. For example, one of the drawbacks with some of these really vibey kind of plugins that add so much to the sound is that very often you have to post EQ. You know, I EQ this, but I might actually apply a post EQ, like a very surgical post EQ, where I'm actually getting rid of some of the extra frequency range that it is affecting, because many of these EQs have very wide curves.
Right.
Okay, they have very wide cues.
So can you bring up HLS or Pi again? I have a question here from Bruce. G'day, Bruce. And his question is actually a really good one. When you're dealing with this kind of music, or any kind of music, but you're working with this kind of model of a hardware, and you've already said that you love this and you love the Pi, where do presets come into this when it comes to guiding you through what works and what doesn't? Because obviously we support a lot of presets. How do you feel about presets?
I'm a preset junkie. I was just saying, and I have, no shame on it. I love to go through people's presets. I love to go through, just experiment and just throw things in, like the same. And even with my own stuff, for example, I create presets of bassing for percussion, for something like this. And I might have something else from another project I did for another flamenco project that actually sounded completely different. For example, Niña Pastori. And I might just imported it as a template and switching between them and try to collect my thoughts and see, okay, what was my thinking process with that one? And it's an amazing learning process. And it actually keeps you inspired by going through presets. When I get stuck with a mix, in a mix with a specific element of it, that's one of the things I do a lot. I just go like, okay, now let's have fun. Let's just go for it. Like I load, presets, go through them and try to mess things up. And then I might find, that tiny little element of inspiration. I might not use that full preset as it is, but it triggers something that, it's revealing. Like, for example, it might be something about the low end something about, how the vocals sign in the top end. I mean, there are so many elements to a mix, but yeah, I have no shame on saying, I think presets are quite amazing, and
So
they are
yeah.
a great, not just a start point, but a great inspirational tool.
I think also one of the other things to add to that is the fact that we never actually stop learning. So when you do your Waves update plan and you suddenly realize that a plugin has extra presets, that's one of those points where I know it's like, ooh, such and such did a preset. I want to hear what that sounds like. So, okay, so I have a question here from Juan. Hi, Juan. One says, "Hi Rafa, how do you equalize and pan the main flamenco guitar in a track like this? How do you deal with that so that it's present but it still has a lot of space?"
To me, with flamenco guitars, there are several elements to it, right? That you can do. But one of the things with flamenco guitars, let me actually start, for example, for some of the. Let me actually start from scratch with some of the elements of this. I'm duplicating. I'm gonna get rid of a lot of stuff. Let me pass differently. Let me pass to the stereo bus.
You are a master of bussing.
For example, there was a full debate, when people talk about mono stereo, bounces of the tracks. For example, in this case, they gave me 2 stereos for left and right, but they truly are monos, okay? You have to be quick at evaluating what's truly stereo, what's truly mono. In this case, for the practicality of it, because I notice a slight difference, not just in level, but in sound, if I picked only on a stereo track, for example, like this.
Can we make sure that we've still got audio, by the way? It's like when you press play a second ago, I didn't hear the session.
Sorry. I buzzed to the wrong output. Okay, here we go. Now we got audio. For example, this track, if I split this track into 2 monos and I play with it, I notice, for example, let me mute the rest. I noticed.
So that's on one side.
Yeah, that's on one side, right? That's only on the right side. By doing critical listening, I noticed that playing only the left or only the right had a slightly different texture, and I like it better. And it wasn't just a volume thing. And it might have to do with the fact that maybe, I think this track was originated in Logic. Maybe when they bounce the track, some kind of bus processing, existing bus processing in the system had a slight difference between left and right, and combined, it creates like a very specific kind of sound. So I decided to use both sides of the stereo track. But usually when people send me like mono tracks bounce to stereo, I pick one of the sides and just work on one of the sides, left and right, and choose it and get to work to it. One of the elements that are important to me when I'm working with flamenco guitars is retaining the low frequency punch. And very often I compress that aspect of the guitar. Let me put it in mono so it doesn't sound to the side. Let me make it louder, get rid of the automation. That's something that I will very typically do with any of these rhythmic kind of nylon type of guitars. I will use dynamic compression, I will
Hmm.
focus especially on the very low frequencies. And very often when I'm doing this, I will apply very often another EQ, post this process and apply another EQ and maybe high pass filter the very, very, very low end of the guitar, because I don't want that rumble to make the guitar less distinct. Okay. And then after I do this kind of like zoom in processing of the flamenco guitar, if I wanted to give it more of the nail, in the string, I'll do something like that. Listen to this versus, and even compress a tiny bit in that range, Let me get see the difference between this and this. You make the guitar more explosive, like every one of those hits actually jumps at you a little bit more. Then maybe for something like this, to tighten everything together, I could go for a very, very light overall compression, but doing it here. Let me now inactivate both of them. Now, let me apply this process, for example, to the stereo rhythm as it is, okay? And I'm gonna do a comparison with and without to do like a very, very practical. Let me mute this. Here are the two tracks that we want to process, right? It is these two tracks.
Okay.
So let's listen to them without any processing first. See what the C4 does. See how it actually comes out of the speakers much more. It actually jumps at you much more. Here is the point where I will even evaluate if I really want it all the way to the left or not. Depends on what I'm trying to accomplish in the mix, but also changes your stereo perspective, the broadness of the mix. It changes actually quite a lot. It's the kind of thing that you cannot underestimate. When you do this kind of processing, you are changing the perception in the stereo field. Period.
It's so bizarre. So Rafa, we're gonna start looking at wrapping this up. I have one more question for you. When it comes to all these people who have been watching, I mean, it's like there's been an incredible masterclass on an art form that is what you do. All of these things that you've been talking about during this session on this specific genre, this is all stuff that applies to any music you mix, whether it's an opera, a hip hop track, Lady Gaga, or this kind of genre. Am I correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. These kind of rules have to do with how you perceive emotion and how you can pull emotion out of the tracks, out of the elements that you have in the track. So definitely, my use of the pi could have to do with, I could use it on a synthesizer, on an electronic track, or I could use it, on a pad, on a cinematic mix. So yeah, it truly applies to any style of music. Yeah.
So, what would you say for if you had the chance to give somebody advice who wants to get to the level that you are at, and they're beginning out? What would you say is the best piece of advice you could give them right now, especially as everybody is at home working on their music and isn't really going out that much?
I would say, study your tools, really know your tools. People very often, jump into um, having, I won't say too much. There is never too much. And this is the proof that there is never too much. I'm a gear junkie. I'm a plugin junkie. I love to try things. I love to have the options, but master your options, be a true master of what you have. Go really, really in depth. Try every freaking knob. Try every freaking preset. Don't underestimate what a single plugin can do for you. And try to create templates of how specific plugins interact with each other. For example, if I was working on electronic music, some of the plugins that I use a lot on bass will be the J37, or it could be the Submarine plugin to create, harmonics, other frequencies, musical frequencies. You can actually choose, and fine tune that is the right, it goes fine with the music, and see how it actually interacts with other type of compression plus a plugin or other type of EQ. You really need to master, especially the interaction within plugins. So you don't just create presets of one plugin. You create presets of cluster of plugins. Like, for example, what I show you right now, I have many of these presets where I'll have, the C4 combined with the S1, and also going to a post compression even after the S1. Because, for example, if you apply some kind of a stereo field plugin pre-compression, it sounds very different than applying it post compression. It's a completely different thing. If I apply, for example, the S1, and I widen something out going into a reverb, it sounds very different than if I apply it on the reverb return. Completely different. So you have to master clusters of plugins, and how they actually interact together.
All right, beautiful. Well, I would like to thank you on behalf of everybody who's been watching. Rafa Sardina, thank you so much for this open session. It's been an absolute blast for me. I love this session. It's like I've heard this a few times with you, and I never get sick of it, and I never get sick of listening to your work. Thank you so much, and everybody out there in Wavesland.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much for watching, and we'll be back next week, same time, with Piper Payne. Take care, everybody.
She's great.